Okay, good evening, everyone. I apologize for going off suddenly like that, but we're back. It's Parshas Mishpatim, Tavshin Pei Vav 5786. So, Perek Chav Gimel, chapter 23, Pasuk Beis, verse 2. Lo yisana achrei rabim l'ra'os, do not follow the majority to do evil, which Rashi explains means that if there's a majority of judges who are corrupt and they are judging in a wrongful way, don't follow that majority. Meaning, even though, right, you should be following a majority, but when the majority is doing something evil, don't follow them. V'lo yisana al riv l'ntois achrei rabim lahatos. And do not respond to a quarrel, meaning do not respond to meaning the person being judged, asks you what you think. So do not respond lintois acharei rabim, to lean towards what the majority are saying, lahatos, again, to pervert the judgment, which means you see the majority of judges are being corrupt and are judging in an evil manner. And then the question is asked to you by the person being judged, what do you think? And so you cannot just say, you cannot follow the majority because it's a majority, but rather, meaning don't respond to the quarrel, meaning don't respond regarding dispute, to lean after the majority, just to follow the majority, to lean after the majority to lahatos means to pervert the law, but rather, as Rashi says, say what's true, and the fact that they're going to have to follow the majority anyway is not your problem. That's their responsibility. Okay, so the pasuk is talking about when not to follow the majority. But the implication is that there is a time for following the majority, which is where there is a regular judgment going on, and different judges have different opinions. And then we say, as the last words in the verse reads, acharei rabim lahatos, you should follow the majority. If there is a majority of judges judging one way, you've got a number of judges. Some judges are saying one way, other judges saying another way. So who do you follow? How do you come to a final decision? Follow the majority. That's the rule. So the pasuk, according to Rashi, in the straightforward explanation, is talking about not to follow when they're acting in a wrongful manner, not because you don't agree with them, but because they're acting in a wrongful manner. You know that they're judging wrongly. You know they're judging because of corruption. Don't follow that. That's what the pasuk in the straightforward explanation is saying. But our sages derive, they read that they explain the verse in they break it up in a different way, so that at the end we read acharei rabim lahatos, which means after majority is where to follow. And that's the rule. You follow the majority. Okay. So now, with that in mind, I want to share with you, I think, a story from the Talmud that I have mentioned many times before, but it's very relevant to this concept of following the majority. So the Talmud in Baba Metzia, Tractate Baba Metzia, 59b, Nun Testament Beis, tells the story of a famous argument that took place between the sage of the times of the Mishnah, named Rabbi Eliezer, and his colleagues. And the argument there was an argument regarding a matter of what we refer to as Tuma and Tahara, were the laws of ritual purity and impurity. And I'm not going to go into what the issue at hand was, but basically you had that Rebbe Lezer was saying that it was pure, and the other sages were saying impure. And the Talmud says that as much as Rebbe Lezer tried convincing his colleagues that he was correct, as many proofs and arguments that he made, they didn't accept. They didn't agree. So he became a bit extreme, I'll call it. So the Gemara says that he said to his colleagues, if the halacha is like me, meaning you want to see how the halacha is like me, that carob tree that's right there, a carob tree, that big tree over there, is going to become uprooted. It's going to come out of the ground. If I'm right, that's what's going to happen. It wasn't witchcraft on his part. It was somehow or another summoning nature, or maybe the angels of nature, to respond, to get involved. So he said, if I'm right, that carob tree is going to come out of the ground. And that's what happened. Came right out of the ground, flew out of the ground, and flew a long distance. So what did his colleagues say? No proofs from a carob tree. Then he said, okay, you see that You see that stream of water? You see how it's flowing? It's going to start flowing backwards. And that's what happened. It started flowing backwards. Colleague said, no proofs from a stream. Then he said, okay, you want to know that I'm right? If I'm right, or we need to show you that I'm right. If I'm right, the walls of this building, of this study hall, this base medrash will come down. And the wall started coming down. And the Talmud says that the sage, Rabbi Yeshua, got up and said to the walls, when Torah scholars are arguing, you don't get involved. Stop falling. Finally, Rabbi Eliezer said, if I'm correct, let a heavenly voice come out and say I'm right. And the heavenly voice came out and said, why are you arguing with Rabbi Eliezer? He's always right. The halach always follows him. Heavenly voice. That means a voice from heaven is saying Rabbi Eliezer is right. What are you arguing with him for? And Rabbi Yeshua got up and said, Loi b'shamayim hi. It's not in heaven. The Torah is not in heaven. Okay, and the explanation of that is Shekvar nitna Torah mehar Sinai. The Torah is already given from Mount Sinai. Einona mashkichem bevasko. We don't pay attention to a heavenly voice. Shekvar kasavta b'har Sinai b'Torah. For you, Hashem God, you yourself have written the Torah. Acharei rabim lahatos. You said Hashem in the Torah. Acharei rabim lahatos. You follow the majority. So even if a bas kol comes out, a heavenly voice comes out, Hashem, you said follow the majority. So how should we understand this? Or how do let's get a little bit more understanding to the story. And this comment that I'm going to share with you comes from Rabbeinu Nisim of Gerona. He was a Spanish sage from 1320 to 1376. So he's from the period we call the Rishonim, the early sages, and he was known as the Ran, Rabbeinu Nisim, our Rabbi Nisim. And like many rabbis, like Rashi, Rambam, we call them by an acronym, and this was Ran, Rabbeinu Nisim. So Rabbeinu Nisim has drushas, these sermons, and in this sermon he addresses this topic, but he starts from a different saying in the Talmud. And this comes from the Talmud why didn't I write it down? It's from Chagiga, from Tractate Chagiga, Gimel Amid Beis, 3b. And there's a verse in the book of book of Koheles, Ecclesiastes, that reads like this: Divrei Chacham kadarvainos uchamas merais. The words of the wise are as goads and as nails. Netuim b'alei asufos, well planted are the sayings of the masters of assemblies, the masters of people who come together. Nitnu meraya echad, they are given from one shepherd. So the Talmud says, what does it mean? B'alei asufos, who are the masters of assemblies? Talmud says, Elu talmidei chachamim, these are the Torah scholars. Sheyoshvin asufos meiskim b'Torah. They assemble together. They come, they make gatherings together, and they study Torah. And what happens there? Halolu metamin, v'lolu metarin. Some of them say they argue, right? They argue. Some say tamei, impure. Some say pure. Some say forbidden. Some say permissible. Some say kosher. Some say not kosher. That's what's happening when they gather together, right? They're arguing. So the Talmud says maybe somebody who observes this is going to say, how am I supposed to study Torah now? How am I supposed to, he says one way, he says another way. I don't know who's right. I don't know who's wrong. What should I do? For that, the pasuk, the verse says, Nitnu meroya echad. All of them were given from one shepherd. Kel echad nasnan, one God gave them. Parnas echad amaran, one leader taught them, referring to Moshe. Mipiadon kolamasim baruchu, from the master of all things, as it says, Vayedaber Elokim es kol ha'devarim ha'ela. Hashem said all these things. What does it mean, all these things? Okay, well, he said all these things. Going back on, give me 1 second. Right. Going back on, again, we just said the Baalei Sufras are arguing, and you want to know, like, what should I do? Who should I follow? Who should I learn from? And the answer is, it all comes from the same God and from the same agent that gave over the Torah. And therefore, go study, hear out all opinions, and study all opinions, and then eventually from there you'll decide which way you'll follow, because you'll become one of the scholars, and you'll then figure out which way to follow. So what we have here is, according to the way the Ran understands the Gemara, that the Gemara is saying, we had these ones saying this and these ones saying this, right? And we're saying they all come from God. What do you mean they all come from God? One's right, one's wrong, right? Either it's Tameh or it's Tahar. One is right and one's wrong. So, okay, we can only do our best to figure out what's what. But they all were given at Sinai? They all came from God at Sinai? What does that mean? So the Ran explains, based on another Gemara, another statement from the Talmud, which is in Tractate Megillah, Yutes Amid Beis 19b, that we have again the Gemara, the words about the 10 Commandments, about the tablets that the commandments were on, va'aleim, and upon them, meaning upon the commandments, kol kechava dvarim, like all the things. So the Talmud says that word, like all the things, comes to include something is not as obvious as just what was written on the tablets, but rather Melamed teaches us that God showed Moshe dikdukei Torah v'dikdukei sofer ma'asher sefer ma'asidim l'chadash. Hashem showed Moshe the fine points of the Torah, the fine points of the sages, and what the sages in the future are going to institute, which the Talmud there is referring to Purim. Purim was instituted not from Sinai, right? Not from Moshe. It was many years later. It's considered a rabbinic institution. Moshe was shown that. But the Gemara says that it wasn't just that, but he was shown the dikdukei sofrim, the fine points of the scribes. What does that mean, the fine points of the scribes? So the Ran understands it as the arguments that they had. That means, these are the words, the arguments and different opinions sheben Chachmei Yisrael, of the sages of Israel. V'kulan lamda Moshe mipi Gvura. Moshe learned them all from Hashem. Hashem told Moshe at Har Sinai all the future arguments that are going to happen. Told them all the future arguments, all the different opinions. Beis Shammai is going to say this about this, and Beis Hillel is going to say this about this. But however, when Hashem told them to Moshe, it was below hachra. But he didn't tell him which one will be considered the accepted opinion. He showed them the different opinions. They didn't say which one is going to be accepted. But what God did give to Moshe is what everybody knows the truth knows, and that is, how do you decide an argument? Acharei rabim lahatis. You follow the majority. Follow the majority. And the Torah also tells us that when there is an argument, there's a question, you go to the sages and they have to decide it. And once they decide it, no straying from what they say. And he explains, now there was a point of time there weren't so many arguments amongst the Jewish people, amongst the sages. But once these kind of arguments began increasing, and the reason, without getting into too much right now, but again, it had a lot to do with the fact that because of being in exile and not being there, so with the Beis Hamikdash, being in exile, there were certain parts of the tradition and understanding that were being lost. And the later sages had to, again, study and figure out, but no one had it as clear as before, or had the tradition the same as before, or the understanding that there was before, and therefore arguments developed. So once arguments developed, and the Torah recognizes that it's going to be such a thing, that's why it says, Acharei rabim lahatis, follow the majority. Now again, that could be in a very specific kind of case too. But he's saying that this applies even to these kinds of of arguments that have to do with establishing what's the law of the Torah, what to establish principal laws of the Torah. So he says, if you had one person against many, again, about these kinds of arguments about the laws of the Torah, how to interpret the Torah, how to understand its laws, how to apply its laws, you follow the majority. And if it was a case of many against many, or an individual against an individual, then what, if I understand it correctly, then what happened is he says, then it's according to what the sage of that generation feel, which means you could have had a generation where the sages argued about something and they never came to a decision who to follow. So who's going to make that decision? Later generation sages had to make that decision. And even though they were basically deciding between earlier generations, this was what the Torah told them to do. The Torah told them, okay, now you have to sit down, and what will the majority of you figure out what should be regarding this? Yes, you know there were earlier generations that were arguing about it, but now you have the power to decide. And when you have that power, and if you don't decide that power, what does he say it? Right. So he says, the decision was given to them, as the pasuk says, "You will come to the Kohanim, the judge will be in those days, do not stray." The sages of the generations were given the ability to decide about the arguments of earlier sages, according to what they say. Even if the earlier generations were greater than them, and even more than them. But still, the Torah says they decide. You'll go to the judges and the Kohanim, the Leviim, they were the teachers in those days. You'll go to them for a decision and you will follow them. But it's Tavinu Lelech Achar Haskamasam, and we have to follow their decision. Hein Sheyaskimu Le'emes Lehavchai. Whether they got it right or not. Whether they got it right or not. That is what lies in Acharei Rabim Lahatas, follow the majority. There were arguments. Somebody's right, somebody's wrong. But the fact that Hashem, my understanding of the Ran is, the fact that Hashem showed Moshe these different opinions means to say that any one of these opinions could be valid. It's all going to depend on what the generation of that time, what the majority of sage generation of that time are going to say. But he showed it to Moshe because it's not like one is right and one is wrong. They're both understanding the best that they can. And at the end, who's going to decide which way to go? Not Hashem, but they are. The majority of them are. And as he says, whether truthfully they're right or wrong, meaning ultimately somebody has to really be right? There is a truth. It's not like there's no truth. There is a truth. In the sense of, from God's point, there's a truth, right? What is it? Is it pure or is it impure? Is it kosher or is it not kosher? What is it? There is a truth. There is an ultimate truth. But at the end of the day, we have to attempt to understand as we can. And then the Torah says, follow the majority. And he says, that was what happened in the story in Baba Metzia. If a heavenly voice comes out and says, Rebbe Eliezer is right, so what's the truth? What's the truth? The truth is, Rebbe Eliezer is right, because God said so, didn't he? It doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. He's right. He's right. If God says this is the truth, that's the ultimate truth. But it doesn't mean that's what you're going to do down here, practically. Practically, Hashem said it doesn't matter. Achrei Rabim Lahatis, to follow the majority. And that's what Rebbe Eliezer kept trying to push it, and nonetheless, the sages wouldn't give in, because they understood that even though it could very well be that Rebbe Eliezer is right, and he is right. He is right. If God said he's right, he's right. He has the ultimate truth. But if we cannot understand that ultimate truth, if we who are worthy of trying to understand the Torah and make the decisions of how to practice the Torah, if we cannot understand that, then at the end of the day, what is Torah? What is going to be lived by? What is Torah? that is going to be what the majority falls by. Where's the majority? So when putting it all together, when we had Rebbe Lezer and the heavenly voice came out and said Rebbe Lezer's right, in the sense of ultimate truth, he was right, because God said he's right. But as Rabbi Yeshua said, but you, Hashem, already told us in the Torah, which tells us how we are to live our lives. You told us, Acharei Rabim Lahatos, you follow the majority. That's what you said. When you're dealing with questions, you follow the majority. It doesn't say you follow the majority unless God gets involved. You follow the majority. The Torah was given to man to be able to figure out as best as he can, and that is what Torah is. That is what is practiced and lived by. That's Torah. And that was the understanding, and that's the point also of the fact that the two arguments, all the arguments were shown to Moshe, because even though, as the Ran says, one's right, one's wrong, but at the end of the day, they're both shown to Moshe by God because they both can be right. They both, at the end of the day, could be right. And it's the way the sages understand that's going to decide at the end, on the majority, which one is going to be the right, which one is going to be the way to go. And it doesn't matter at ultimately or in an absolute sense, which one is really right. Because if the majority, again, who are worthy, and worthy means learned enough and righteous enough and great enough to be able to make these kinds of decisions, make the majority make the decision, then that's what's followed. And even if Hashem himself were to get involved, it doesn't make a difference. So it's an unbelievable idea. But it also, bringing it into bringing it down a little more, carrying it further down in the way we approach Torah. Rabbis, great rabbis, Rav Moshe Feinstein, for instance, and many like him had to make, there all generations, all times have their particular questions and particular problems, and they all have to be figured out according to Torah law. And it's up to our scholars, our sages, to figure it out. And a scholar can say, well, who am I to figure this kind of stuff out? Who am I to do that? Torah is it's a difficult question. It's a difficult subject. Do I really know enough to be able to answer the question? Right, Moshe Feinstein said, if you are worthy of it, meaning you're knowledgeable, you've studied. Not every person who calls himself a scholar, right, is capable of being able to make these kinds of very serious halakhic decisions. Some of them aren't even worthy of well, okay. They're not worthy of they're not worth. Not everybody is worthy of being able to make these kinds of very serious halachic decisions for another person, to make halachic decisions about what the Torah wants. Not everybody's worthy of that. Maybe there may be people who think they're worthy of it, and whether it's in halachic ideas or in ethical ideas or in philosophical ideas, people who are going to lay out ideas that people are going to live by have to be people that are worthy of that. Worthy means they are knowledgeable. They're very knowledgeable. Not only very knowledgeable, they're very God-fearing. And they approach it with the fear of God and humility when they study Torah. But at the end of the day, and they make the decisions, at the end of the day, those decisions are going to be made by someone who is going to take that challenge. And Moshe Feinstein said, you take the challenge, you do your best, and you make your decision. Because the Torah was given for us to decide. That's what it's done. It was given for us to decide. And therefore, a person who is worthy enough of doing that, who has a responsibility to do that, is responsible enough to do that, does it. Because the Torah is given to us in a way that we have to figure it out according to the best way that we can. And with that, that's what we follow. That's what we do. Now, we don't necessarily have any more of these kinds of, academies of scholars that they all come together and a majority can decide which way we're going to go, which way we're not going to go. We don't have that. So really, it's kind of left to individual rabbis and those who follow their rabbis. But at the end of the day, that rabbi, like a Rav Moshe Feinstein, like a Rabbi Yashiv, like them, These were people who, again, they dedicated their lives to Torah. They dedicated their lives to being God-fearing and religious and observant, and of being kind and giving. All these things are part of who they were and the decisions that they made. But at the end of the day, a person has to understand that although Torah is very vast and very great, and the challenges of being able to apply it are great challenges, nonetheless, there is this idea that Torah was given to us. We do our best with it, and we move forward with that. And even if we're not on the level of making these kinds of difficult halachic decisions, anytime we approach Torah study, we have to look at it as, yes, Torah is very great and very broad. And a person can think, can I really get a real understanding of what's going on? And the answer is, I don't know how much understanding you can get. But the Torah was given for us to learn to the best of our ability, to understand according to the best of our ability, and to work with that. And therefore, and that I think is the lesson that we can carry to all different levels of our Torah study. Thank you for listening. Have a wonderful evening.